Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Ryan Lee, and I'll be your host today, and I hope once again you're staying safe amidst the pandemic. And we have got a lot to go over today, including the latest changes inside the top 25, our upset picks of the week, my picks from last week and how I did, but let's get right into it. Number one, just a quick small update with some pandemic-related news that came about ever since the end of the Saturday show. The Wisconsin Badgers had the game canceled versus the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And the thing about that game was that the initial reporting, the one that I was shown, and the one that I reported on, it said there were a half dozen players and a half dozen coaches, each testing with the virus. Well, according to new figures by the athletic director of the Wisconsin Badgers, numbers have now risen to 22 positive tests for the virus. And the reason why that's important is because there's such a bigger impact when you have more people infected inside the locker room. I believe I called it on Saturday's show that once you start getting into things like contact tracing, the incubation period is going to start getting a little fishy. Things are starting to get a little bit harder, especially for this team. And it's definitely seeing the case it is today, because now you have more players tested positive, more coaches being tested positive, and because of that, what's going to be the end result? The end result is that you have a whole bunch of people on this team who are not as well as they should be. And that's going to be a problem moving forward. But I'll get into that in another segment. That's just a quick news update. And one of the things that I actually really want to talk about is the changes within the AP Top 25. Now, I think this is actually a very interesting list. I think the more and more that we go on, this list really takes into its shape, because we keep seeing a lot of the same culprits in this list. Now, we also see a lot of the same culprits jumping around on the list, which might be an indicator of something, if you ask me. And as this top 25 list slowly starts to come to fruition, you get some of the usual contenders like the Clemsons, the Alabamas, the Ohio States, and a lot of the teams who kind of bounce around amongst the bottom of the top 25 because streaking, or they just have some great wins, like in Oklahoma, like in SMU, like in Auburn, just finally getting back into the list after about 2.5 weeks off. It really puts them in a really interesting position, because I don't know what to expect from a lot of these teams anymore. And the crazy thing is that the Pac-12 comes back this weekend. Now, I'll get more to that in the Saturday show, but the reason why that's so important is because you have a lot of teams either in the top 25 or just outside of it who are still receiving votes. And things that they're still receiving votes, that means that they definitely have a chance to weasel their way into everything. Oregon is ranked at number 12 right now. You got USC at number 20. You've got Utah just sitting outside the top 25. Washington's been getting votes. San Diego State got votes. Arizona State got votes. Cal got a bunch of votes. So it's a lot of things that you really have to consider when it comes to this list, especially now with the reintroduction of the Pac-12. I think, generally speaking, this list makes a lot of sense to me. Wisconsin, they dropped one because Wisconsin dropped one because teams like BYU and Florida and A&M all had great performances last week. I understand that. And yeah, Oklahoma State had a massive drop because they got upset by Texas, who actually climbed their way back in the top 25 this weekend. All of that makes sense. So I think the thing about this ranking is that it is starting to become indicative of not just who the best teams are, but with the situation going on right now, it is more or less about who is the best at adjusting with the times. Now, what I say about that is not necessarily about offensive scheme or defensive scheme or whatever it may be. It's simply about who is adapting best to the virus. University of Florida, a lot of their starters have either recovered or they're still in quarantine right now, and they're still playing excellent football, which is why they stay at number 8. I don't know what to think about Wisconsin, but if they can come back in a few weeks from now, play a game, and absolutely go lights out, then I can expect them to stay in the top 10. A lot of these teams have had either a positive here or there. Almost every single one of them I can think of. North Carolina, they did not adjust well to getting the virus in their locker room. I think it actually hurt their morale a little bit. I think it really hurt that locker room chemistry, that locker room energy, because clearly something has not been working for UNC lately. To give an example, some of these teams, they are adaptable. They can change and they can roll with the punches. One of the biggest things that a lot of sportscasters that they think about when considering anything is how good they are adjusting. Going into halftime, going into the next game, going into the next drive, the next play, whatever it may be. How good are you at adjusting? There's a reason why Oklahoma State tanked 8 spots from their previous week. They were number 6 team in the country. And what they do, they got upset by Texas. Why? Because they didn't adjust to the game plan. Simply put, Oklahoma State simply got a little too rigid in their game plan. And if they did a little more adjusting and a little more acclimating to Sam Ehlinger and really force him into some stuff, Sam Ehlinger, get some pressure on him on the secondary, forcing him to wait a little bit longer, and then you get pressure on him, then he has to make a bad throw. That's how you get Sam Ehlinger to crack a little bit. But Oklahoma State did none of that because they did not adjust to what he was doing right or what he was doing wrong. I could say the exact same thing about Jim Harbaugh. He was the biggest tanker with Michigan. Wolverines did not acclimate their game plan whatsoever. Maybe in desperation mode, the 4-minute offense, sure, why not? But aside from that, what else did they do to adjust to the way Michigan State was playing? They didn't try to do off-man coverage. They kept doing press-man coverage when the receivers kept zooming past them. They didn't try to put any pressure on the zone. They didn't try to go off-man coverage or anything like that. Or they didn't try to change up any blitzing schemes or anything like that to try and create pressure on Michigan State and the Spartans. And there's a reason the Spartans won that game. I'm going to get more into that later. But one of the big things about the sport that make it so beautiful is that it is the biggest game of chess in the world. You are not playing chess with simply 16 pieces. You're playing with 22. And the crazy thing is that one of your pieces of said chessboard has to play as well. So imagine that. It's a chess game where one of the pieces has to call the shots as well. If not, 2 of them have to call the shots. And then you have to include substitutions. And then you have to include injury sub-ins. You got to include special teams. It's the craziest game of chess. And clearly what happened? Well, Jim Harbaugh couldn't come up with a new strategy on the spot. Clearly Mike Gundy could not come up with a new strategy on the spot. He couldn't adjust to what was working for them or adjust to what was not. Tom Herman was able to. Mike D'Antonio was able to. It's one of my favorite things about this game is the complex nature of it, turning everything to chess. One of the things that really has been surprising me lately is the resurgence of Oklahoma, because they've been mostly down and out all year. You see them Start the year off 1-2. Every single game since they've won. They started off 1-2, and then they win a bunch of close games. They beat Texas in quadruple overtime. They beat TCU. They blow out Texas Tech. They've been pleasantly surprising. Actually, the biggest jumpers. They went to 5 spots up from 24 to 19. I think this is evidently good for Oklahoma. Because the thing about them is they have such a young quarterback in Spencer Rattler. He's a freshman. He's got a big arm. He's big too, I believe. He's like 6'2" or something like that. They're slowly building their way up into the rankings. Right now they sit at 4th in the Big 12. And yeah, they've won a bunch of games since. But now the question is, how do they stack up against lesser opponents? Like Kansas, who I believe still has yet to gather a win. Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State, that's going to be most likely 2 ranked opponents. West Virginia just gave Kansas State, one of Oklahoma's losses, a big fight. And then Baylor. They've had their ups and downs. One of the things I'm very intrigued by is the breakdown of the top 2. Because currently, Clemson is beating Alabama by 2 points. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the way that these polls work is that the AP, the Associated Press, has a system in which they rank these teams, which is that everyone in their staff ranks the teams, and every single placement has a point value. And then what happens is that they add up all the points, and that's how you get your rankings. In the last couple of weeks, it's actually been relatively close between Alabama and Clemson as the top 2. About a 50-point separation in Week 8. In terms of first place voting alone, let's just go back to Week 8. 54-8. And then you go into Week 9. The separation is still there, about 40 points, which is actually quite a bit. And the first place voting is once again heavily skewed towards Clemson, 52-10. Now this week was different. What separates them is 2 points. And the number of first place votes were 33-29 in favor of Clemson. It's a very small gap. But at the same time, I want to give Clemson a lot of credit for dressing and starting a freshman quarterback. DJ Oyunglele was really good for a first start. And I'm actually going to talk about him a little bit more on the Saturday show. Because I said earlier, when Trevor Lawrence is going to be knocked out, it is up to DJ Oyunglele to fill those shoes. And that's going to be a big segment I'm going to be talking about on my Saturday show. Coming up right after the break, we've talked about the rankings, and now we got to go into my biggest upset of the week, why it was, how it happened. That's all coming up right after this.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, Ryan Lee back here once again, and I want to talk about, specifically, I want to talk about rivalries today. There are some amazing rivalries in sports. A lot of them get so heated. A lot of them get so riled up. And every single time you see those two play, you know something amazing that come out of it. Michigan, Ohio State is a big one. Texas and Oklahoma, another big one. If I want to go in the NFL, you know for a fact that you're going to see something huge when it comes to Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Those type of rivalry games are what makes sports so great. If you've ever seen the Battle of Alberta, I would highly recommend it. In the NHL, National Hockey League, the Edmonton Oilers versus the Calgary Flames, I can argue it's the greatest rivalry in sports. But we're not here to talk about hockey. We're here to talk about college football. But I highly recommend, though, go on YouTube. Edmonton Oilers versus Calgary Flames. That is something to bestow upon, is that rivalry. And we actually had a major rivalry actually happen over this past weekend. The Battle of Michigan. Number 13, the Michigan Wolverines, taking on the unranked Michigan State Spartans. Both teams currently sitting at 1-1 now, but it wasn't for a certain set of things happening now. This is easily going to be my upset pick of the week for so many reasons. Number one is because Michigan was so heavily favored. The Wolverines were favored by 21.5 going into this game. I didn't even watch the first half of this game because I was expecting a blowout. I did not expect this game to be remotely good. And then I'm just checking scores on my phone and I see 14-10, Michigan State. And I'm like, maybe I'll pop that one on and see the second half. And I had to catch the rest on highlights. Because the thing about rivalry games and what makes them so beautiful is that no matter who is favored or who's the underdog or who is in what position or whatever it is, you are going to expect 100% of the time. We saw it with the Red River Showdown with Oklahoma and Texas. They went to quadruple overtime. They literally bit tooth and nail and scratched and clawed and literally went to the end. Which is exactly what you expect from such an amazing rivalry. Let's break down some numbers super quickly. The total yardage gained, they're actually very similar. 449 for the Spartans, 452 for the Wolverines. That breaks down to 323 yards for Michigan State and 300 for Michigan. In the air with 126 yards on the ground for the Spartans, with 152 for the Wolverines. No turnovers the entire game. Michigan actually had clock control, 33-47 to 26-13. And the thing is that they even controlled the possessions. Michigan did 28 first downs to 20, and they even got a better third down conversion ratio of 7-17, which simply breaks down to about 41% versus 5 for 14 for the Spartans, which goes to 36%. Jim Harbaugh's made it to the Super Bowl. But the thing about rivalries like this is you can expect the best out of all your players. Now, Joe Milton wasn't exactly the best player on earth, but his stat line isn't bad. 32 for 51, breaks down to about 63%, 300 yards on the dot. But the thing is that Michigan did both of their damage on the ground. Hassan Haskins with 56 yards and a touchdown, and Blake Corum, 15 yards and 2 touchdowns. Clearly more of a ground and pound guy. And honestly, Rocky Lombardi looked really solid. Aside from his completion percentage, which was 53%, he looked really good. 323 yards and a trio of touchdowns. One of them going to Ricky White, who had 196 yards and a touchdown, which is insane. And Connor Hayward, 15 yards, 2 touchdowns. Also really good. Ricky White essentially could not be stopped for the Spartans. And this is what I meant in the first segment when I said Jim Harbaugh needed better game planning. Because what did Harbaugh do? They saw that they had one receiver essentially get all the load. 8 of 17 receptions for the entire team went to Ricky White. They didn't try to double him. They didn't try to contain him anyway. They didn't try to, get physical, hand fight, check him down all at the line. None of that. That's on the defensive coordinator and Jim Harbaugh for communication reasons. When your receiver is performing that well, half of the team's receptions, 196 yards, makes up for 60% of the team's receiving yards. That simply comes down to adjusting. It simply comes down to double him. And literally what you're doing is you're daring Ricky Lombardi to throw to anyone else. They left Ricky White alone a lot. And because of that, Lombardi was able to find those dots. Minus 21.5. According to the win probability meter, 94% for Michigan. The thing about this is that if you look at the game breakdown, it essentially goes Michigan State, Michigan, Michigan State, Michigan, Michigan State, Michigan, so on and so forth the entire game. The only discrepancy is that they had a field goal followed by a touchdown at the end of the third going into the fourth. These teams were essentially trading blow for blow, which is exactly what you want out of a good rivalry game. You want to see a back and forth game. But once again, 94% win probability. Minus 21.5. That has been our upset of the week. Michigan State beating the number 13 Michigan Wolverines, and coming up right after the break, my top 3 games of the week. Put your money where your mouth is. Let's see how we did last week. Let's see how we've been doing on the season, and how did my picks pan out. That's going to be coming up right after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Back here once again, here on the GSMC College Football Podcast. Ryan Lee, once again here for the final time. We have talked about some of our latest changes in the top 25 according to the AP, as well as my upset pick of the week, Michigan State over the University of Michigan Wolverines. And now we're going to go into one of my personal favorite segments, Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. And to say the least, I did not have my greatest week in the world. I've had much better weeks before. To put it simply, I actually went 1-2 this week. And this is only my second losing week thus far of making predictions here on the GSMC College Football Podcast. And it goes back to my very first week, week 1. I was 1-2. I, unfortunately for me, am 1-2 again this week, which puts me at a grand total of 12-5-1. Now, statistically speaking, it's pretty good. Nothing crazy to be overly concerned about. I've actually been pretty on it so far. Now, let's start with the 2 losses first. Get those out of the way. And then we can talk about the one game that I actually got correct. The first one, I'm not super proud of. I'm actually a little upset about myself about it. I called the fact that if Kansas State cannot shut down West Virginia and their offense, because they had a very high-flying offense, if it cannot be shut down, West Virginia won't be beat. But I said that Kansas State most certainly has a chance to make it close. I was wrong. That is why the West Virginia Mountaineers are currently sitting at 4-2. That is why the Kansas State Wildcats are currently at 4-2. It is simply because the Mountaineers offense did a much better job than initially planned to. Literally, once the initial field goal was scored by Kansas State, West Virginia just kept piling it on. Field goal, a trio of touchdowns, Kansas State responds with a touchdown, and then for West Virginia, it is field goal, touchdown, field goal. Ends the game at 37-10. Now, the thing is that statistically speaking, West Virginia did have domination pretty much the entire game. And it makes sense as to why. 23 first downs as opposed to 13. 9 for 18 on third down, which is 50%, versus 6 of 14, which is 42%. 485 total yards of offense for the Mountaineers versus 225 for the Wildcats. 301 yards in the air and 284 yards on the ground for West Virginia versus Kansas State's 184 yards in the air and 41 yards on the ground. And the turnover possession was even worse. 1 forced fumble given up by West Virginia and a trio of interceptions thrown by Kansas State, which included a pick 6. And the time of possession was 34 minutes to 25 minutes in favor of West Virginia. Now, the thing about this game is that this is a tale of 2 very different teams. Simply put, they're very different. One team was able to find their rhythm early, find their momentum, find their drive, and just continue running with it. They did not stop ever since then. West Virginia literally had so much momentum to carry over, drive after drive after drive. And the thing is too is that Jared Dedge had himself an absolutely amazing game. 22 for 34. That comes out to about 65%. 301 yards and a pair of touchdowns is absolutely amazing. Letty Brown also had an amazing game, 102 yards and a touchdown as well. And even Bryce Ford Wheaton got himself 104 yards, and he even got TJ Simmons up in the 53 range as well off a pair of catches. They really spread the ball around. The Mountaineers did. 8 different receivers were able to get at least 2 catches. The Wildcats, however, not so lucky. Will Howard only had 19 for 37, which only comes about 55%, 184 yards, a touchdown, and 3 picks. Those 3 picks are absolutely crucial, especially because West Virginia was getting so much pressure on Will Howard. Because the thing about West Virginia is that they got a pair of sacks, 6 tackles for loss, and 9 passes defensed, which simply means that they were getting so much pressure on Howard that by the time that he made a decision, there was maybe a defender or 2 already in his face. He just simply cannot operate like that. It just makes it way too difficult to actually get anything done. It just makes it so difficult. Because you can't find a rhythm, you can't find a pace when your quarterback essentially has no time and space to throw it. Yes, Kansas State got a pair of sacks as well, including 9 passes, including 9 tackles for loss, sure. But the difference is that it didn't really seem to phase Will Dedge at all. All the pressures the Mountaineers were producing, it really seemed to put pressure on Howard of the Wildcats. This is why they dropped out of the rankings. They went from 16 to out of the top 25. Kansas State had good potential as a team. But maybe this slap in the face by West Virginia was exactly what they needed. Because now the Big Ten remains wide open. I don't know what it is. But this year, we can honestly have a surprise with Iowa State and Kansas State. And number 3 in that conference, Oklahoma State, who let the Texas Longhorns upset them in a huge game in overtime, 41-34. Now, the thing about these is that it puts the Longhorns in an interesting position. They jump to 4-2. They hand the Cowboys their first loss. The thing is that they let that happen in the first place where they got that close. Because the thing is, Oklahoma State was leading going into the half 24-20. And they got a touchdown right out of the gate, which put them up by 11. And then all of a sudden the lead is tied and blown completely. The Cowboys were scoring touchdowns on a team who was settling for field goals. In a situation like that, that's a game to put the dagger in. Do what they can to get the touchdown. Kill that momentum, kill that drive, and then next thing you know, Oklahoma State is not driving down the field. However, this game really came down to a lot of really key moments. Number 1, Spencer Ellinger coming in hot. Spencer Ellinger really just doing what he can to will his team into the next down, into the next play. 160 yards for 7 Ellinger is not pretty, but a trio of touchdowns, however, looks amazing. Spencer Sanders had himself an outstanding game, 400 yards and a quad of touchdowns, but the one interception is something that is just not working for them. Once again, Texas kind of a little all over the place with the run game. They ground and pounded it to one of the young guys, Keontae Ingram. He was able to score the 1 touchdown, and Chuba Hubbard couldn't really do anything. Chuba Hubbard really struggled to get anything done. What they can do is they can rely on their other weapon, Tylan Wallace. Pair of touchdowns, 187 yards. Along with Landon Wolf and Chuba Hubbard, who gladfully may not have been able to do so much with his legs, but he still was able to make a huge impact in the receiving attack. Jake Smith and Brandon Eagles, each of them with a touchdown, as well as Joshua Moore. They're one of 2 receivers to even go over 50 this week. And when there's fumbling and when there's potential opportunities there to be made, especially by Longhorns, sometimes when you're the Cowboys, you have to overthink what on God's green earth did we just do. They really do think that sometimes. The thing is that the clock was actually slightly possession by Oklahoma, only 31.5 minutes. They even got loads upon loads of flags. Tom Herman, I don't know what's going on with the team, but 13 flags for 142 yards, that's not acceptable. It really is not. Especially when Texas was getting outgained in every single offensive category by the Oklahoma State Cowboys. 32 first downs to 17. 287 yards versus 530. In the air, Sam Ellinger, 169 yards. Spencer Sanders, well, he helped lead them to 530 yards. 400 of them coming from the air, with the other 130 on the ground. And Sam Ellinger wasn't able to come up that big with his arm. He still came up with 287 yards of offense, 169 yards of defense, as well as major discipline issues. But the thing is that they're not that scared. Sam Ellinger looks so comfortable in the pocket. Because the thing is that he is one of the calmest leaders in the game right now. Because the thing you never really see in the office is you only focus on the scoring plays and you just say, hey, that's that. There's always a much greater story to what happened here. Whether it is something to do with the heat, something to do with why they're out. But that just simply comes with simple adjustment and practice. I personally don't really have any of that big gripes. Just so many turnovers by Oklahoma State. They just could not keep their composure. They just kept making mistakes and shooting themselves in the foot. Which is not good by any means. By any means. Because if you shoot yourself in the foot like that, what does that mean? It usually calls a ground for a comeback. It calls for a ground to someone else and steal your job, essentially. I did wind up taking Oklahoma State minus 3.5. It was a little bit difficult, to be honest. And I honestly didn't exactly know what to make of it. It was a little confusing, honestly. I thought I had more to work with. I thought there was going to be so many greater things that the Cowboys could do because of the way they played against some of their previous opponents. I turned out to be incredibly wrong. The thing about Oklahoma State is that no matter how they try, whatever happens, I think they're always going to be in that shadow of a much larger program. One of them in the same state in the Sooners, and another school who almost bears the same colors in the Longhorns. The difference here is just simply experience and poise. I mean, Spencer Sanders is a sophomore. A little bit of a smaller guy, about 6'1". They got Sam Ellinger, this very large, 6'3" senior. They both were outstanding in the last game. However, it was nothing to do with the quarterback play. Essentially couldn't be done on offense for Oklahoma State. They could get yards like no other. They were crazy with yardage. 530 yards? Yeah, it's a lot of yards. But at the same time, it's also difficult when you've got stuff like after your first touchdown, you get an interception, followed by a punt, and then you get an interception, followed by a touchdown. Then you get a fumble mixed in right before the end of the half, which gives Texas the ability to come within 3. A lot of it gets a little bit crazy and hectic. It's about finding out what side of it you want to be on. The final matchup, including of hectic, this game was absolutely hectic. It was Ohio State versus Penn State. My sole win of the week actually came from this game. I called this game very early at about 10.5. I said I was a little iffy. I'd be a little more confident once at 12, but you know what? I thought 10.5 sounded about right, and it did. Ohio State is one of the most complete teams in all football. There's a reason at number 3. I think Penn State really showed it. Penn State showed a lot of heart, a lot of grit. Did essentially everything they could in their power to stop Ohio State. Ohio State is just too overpowering. It required 3 touchdowns before we could even get close to touchdown territory for the Nittany Lions. Because you know what Penn State did? After 3 touchdowns for the Buckeyes, they only got a field goal. Then they get a touchdown, a pair of touchdowns for Ohio State, a touchdown for the Panthers, and then they trade at the very end. Almost every single number is actually pretty close. I'd say the biggest discrepancy here is in the offensive yardage gain. 526 to 325. That is really over 200-yard difference. And part of that comes out of the air. 281 for the Lions versus 318 for the Buckeyes. But the even biggest gap is the rushing attack. Ohio State, 208 yards. Penn State, 44 yards. I don't know what it is about offenses nowadays, but they do not run anymore for whatever reason. 37 minutes on the clock, the Buckeyes were. 208 to 44 is a big gap. And I wouldn't really say the flags were that big of a factor. I honestly could say it's very difficult to beat any school who has one of the Heisman favorites as your quarterback. Those are some really big shoes to fill. Sean Clifford really had a task trying to match it with Justin Fields' 4 touchdowns and 318 yards. 281 yards is not bad, but 3 touchdowns and a pick is not necessarily as good. They had 0 running game. Penn State did. Master Teague at least got 110 yards and a touchdown. 2 other running backs with 50-plus rushing yards. Chris Olave got 120 yards and a pair of touchdowns, and a bunch of other high-key contributors for Ohio State. Jeremy Rucker got a pair of touchdowns. Garrett Wilson has 111 yards. The only notable player for the Nittany Lions was Johan Dotson. 144 yards and a trio of touchdowns. It's the only thing of note that was available. And it's not like they were both without their pressures. 2 sacks and 5 tackles for loss for the Nittany Lions versus 5 sacks and 7 tackles for loss for the Buckeyes. One of the things I want to say about Ohio State is that they are a complete team. They are as close to as perfect as possible. Ohio State has what it takes to compete with the best of them. The Alabamas, the Clemsons. Ohio State has that. Have that it factor. Ohio State can have a chance. We just need to learn what the format is and how they're going to do this. Because I think the biggest issue for Ohio State, I think it'd be a travesty if they don't get to go to the playoff off of some technicality or some tiebreaker rule. Because if it's anything indicative of last year, it's going to be a close game. It's going to be very close and very tight. I'm only surprised that Ohio State didn't get a single first place vote, but at the same time, it's hard to after 2 weeks, and I completely understand that. And then we just have to wait and see. That's been it for the GSMC College Football Podcast with the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, when you get a chance, feel free to leave us a review down in the comment section below, as well as write a comment. It really helps us out. Feel free to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. All the links can be down in the description box below. And be sure to come back on our preview show this coming Saturday. For all of us here at the GSMC Podcast Network, my name is Ryan Lee. I hope you loved everything that we're doing, and have a great rest of your night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.